Okay. Now, let's talk about the good old boy network. Let's talk about the craft and business. Masonry has been around a long time, and it has been used as a way to get ahead in business for a long time. Masonry began with the stonemason guild, and may surprise you to learn that it was just like, for example, the say the carpenters union that we have today, or the plumbers union, or even the stonemasons union, except for one difference. Back in the Middle Ages, nobody could read. So for example, if you showed up on a job site and the foreman said, "Are you a master mason?" and you whipped out your card and showed it to him, he couldn't read it. That's a problem. So how do you let someone know that you're a master mason if they can't read? Well, the answer is simple. You walk into the job site, you say, "I'm a master mason." You can either use some of these little handshakes, or you can simply do this. You go like this, and the guy knows you're a master mason. And that's all there is to it. You got the job. Just as good as a dues card. Now here's another question. It's more contemporary. Let's say your boss is a mason. Lawyers. Because doctors and lawyers, it used to be, their codes of ethics would not allow them to advertise. I know all of you are probably sick of seeing commercials for lawyers now. But, you know, back in my day, when I was, say, maybe 20, 25 years old, lawyers were not allowed to advertise. And so the only way they could advertise was through the lodge or through similar fraternal organizations. They would develop networks, and that's how they would get referrals. So then we have the whole thing of discounts. I've already alluded to that, for example, you can walk into a store, and if you're a Mason, you say certain little funny words, and they'll give you a discount. And then, of course, the question becomes, how many large corporations are being run today by Masons? Many, many of them. Just one example. How many of you know that Dave Thomas, the guy that owns Wendy's, he's a 33rd degree Mason? Might want to rethink where you buy your hamburgers. Anyway, and it's a shame because I always kind of like that guy. Anyhow, then we've got the lodge and the law. This is even getting more sinister here, folks. Because of what I just mentioned, this whole issue of how lawyers used to build clients, there's always been a close association between the lodge and the law. Large numbers of lawyers and judges are Masons. In fact, in the old days, almost all lawyers were Masons. That's a little bit less true today, and especially obviously if you're a female lawyer, you're not a Mason. But many judges and many lawyers are Masons. Additionally, throughout Europe and America, a disproportionate number of law enforcement people are Masons. In London, it was essentially required that one be a Mason to advance in Scotland Yard or the Metropolitan Police. Untold hundreds of sheriffs in this country and police chiefs are Masons. J. Edgar Hoover, for example, was a 33rd degree Mason. This left a solid Masonic stamp on the FBI, which persists to this day. Now, all of this sounds only vaguely disturbing, but for one thing, and that is the content of the oaths that are given in Masonry. For example, when you take the 3rd degree oath of a Master Mason, one of the codicils in that oath says that you will warn a brother Master Mason of approaching danger so that he can get out of the way. Now let's say you're in the prosecuting attorney's office, or let's say you're a police officer, and you learn that a brother Master Mason is going to have a warrant served on him for his arrest. You're obligated by an oath to go and warn that Mason so he can skip town before he's thrown in the clink. Another thing is that you will notice in the 3rd degree oath that you swear that you will keep the secrets of a Master Mason inviolate within your heart, murder and treason excepted. That means any crime except murder and treason, you are obligated by that blood oath to cover. If he's a rapist, if he's a child molester, if he's a thief, if he's an arsonist, any of that stuff, you have to conceal that. You are not allowed to talk about that. And that's true even if you're an officer of the court. Now it gets even worse. Let's say you're a 7th degree Royal Arch Mason in New York Rite. Then the oath is that you have to keep the secrets of a Royal Arch companion inviolate within your heart, murder and treason not accepted. In other words, you've got to keep everything secret. That guy could be an axe murderer. He could be a traitor to the United States like the esteemed Mason Benedict Arnold was. And the Masons would not be able to reveal that. This is pretty serious stuff. Now, let me give you a couple of examples of this. In many communities, especially in the South, try to bring a case against a Mason. You will not get very far, even in the so-called Bible Belt. True story, the boys and the juvenile court judge. There was a juvenile court judge in the Pacific Northwest who had a predilection for little boys. And basically, he presided over a lot of these juvenile delinquent type hearings, and many times, if he liked the boy would get off in exchange for meeting with the judge in chambers and exchanging certain favors, shall we say. Well, this fellow, they kept trying to bust him, and because he was surrounded by Masons, both in the courts and in the law enforcement, they would always cover up for him. Finally, one of the boys went and titled to the newspaper, and fortunately, the fellow who was the reporter was not a Mason. The story got out. The fellow apparently killed himself, but broken rocks were found in his pocket. Talk more about those broken rocks later. Another true story. There was a financial scam artist in London, and basically he was bilking all sorts of people out of money. And there was a Scotland Yard officer who was trying to nail this guy, and they couldn't get him, and they couldn't get him because the Masons in the yard and the Masons that were surrounding him were protecting him. Finally, the guy did manage to find enough evidence to convict the fellow, but guess what happened to the Scotland Yard official? He was almost busted the meter maid. And they kept giving him the worst possible assignments, and finally the fellow actually had to resign. Then there's the case of the woman who was married to a Shriner. It was his second marriage. He was considerably older than she. She was a young, attractive woman. And he was a member of a very elite shrine organization called the Jesters. Now, if you know anybody who's a jester, be afraid. These are very creepy people. And what would happen in this particular woman's case, and I know it's not isolated because of some of the documents I have seen, every Friday night they would have poker. And he would tie his wife up on the bed, and all the other jesters would rape her. And there was nothing she could do about it. She went to the local police chief, and he was a Shriner. She went to the district attorney, and he was a Shriner. And finally, she was about to go higher than that, and a psychiatrist came to her and said, if you say one more word, we're going to have you locked up as a paranoid delusional because I'm also a Mason. And you'll be locked up forever on my signature, and you'll never get out. She ended up having to flee the state. These are examples of how Masons can cause a miscarriage of justice. But here is probably the most celebrated example of this in the history of the West. Jack the Ripper, a Freemason? The answer to that question is yes, one way or another. Let me explain. For those of you that may not know, Jack the Ripper is probably the Western world's first known serial killer. He murdered 8 prostitutes in Whitechapel district of London in the year 1888, and he had the whole city of London terrified. This was Victorian England, mind you, and nothing like this had ever happened in the history of England that anybody knew of. And here's what happened. They mounted a huge investigation. The man in charge of the investigation was Police Commissioner Warren, who was a Freemason. At that time, the Prime Minister of England, as is often the case, was a Freemason. The heir presumptive to the throne of England, the Duke of Clarence, was also a Mason. And the physician to the royal court at the time, Dr. Gull, was a Freemason. Now, here's what actually happened. The 8 women who were killed, if you study this, and I happen to have been, before I even became a Mason, I was kind of a Jack the Ripper buff. I'd read several of the books about him and kind of studied up. And when I became a Mason, I realized that the horrible way these unfortunate women were murdered was in accord with Masonic ritual gestures. Just one of them had her throat cut from ear to ear, another one had her bowels ripped out of her body and thrown over her left shoulder, and so on and so on. These were Masonic ritual murders. But why? Well, here's what happened. Believe it or not, the Duke of Clarence, who was second in line to the throne of England, had fallen in love with a prostitute. named Annie Crooks. And he married this woman. Now that was bad enough, but he had a child by her, a little girl. And this woman, horror of horrors, was a Roman Catholic. Now, if you understand the way the Parliament and the monarchy work in England, there is a law that no member of the royal family can ever marry a Roman Catholic because of the adversarial relationship that existed for centuries between the Church of Rome and the Church of England. And so this would have shaken the very foundations of the throne of England. So Dr. Gull, who was a physician and surgeon, had Annie Crooks committed to a mental institution where she died by suicide several months later, because of course in those days mental hospitals were not really Club Med, not that they are today either. The little girl, who was 2 or 3 at most, was placed in a Catholic orphanage. But every woman in Whitechapel, from Catherine Beddoes to Mary Jane Kelly, that knew of the wedding and knew Annie Crooks, were horribly murdered to conceal the secrets of a brother Master Mason. Now, you'll notice the thing up there on the board says the Jewes will not be blamed for nothing. Now, you might wonder, what the heck does that mean? Well, this phrase was scrawled on an alley in Whitechapel during the height of the hysteria. What does that phrase mean? Well, believe it or not, Police Commissioner Warren ordered it immediately struck from the alley. It was taken off the alley, erased. He claimed it was because he did not want to have anti-Semitic riots, because he was afraid people would believe the Jews were out there killing prostitutes. Actually, that was a lie. This term, Jewes, is actually a Masonic code word. It refers to the 3 ruffians who murdered Hiram Abiff: Jubilo, Jubilah, and Jubilum. And this was a kind of roundabout way of saying the Masons will not be blamed for nothing. Now, if you want any further proof of this, I would direct your attention to what Jack the Ripper originally called himself, because he wrote letters describing his atrocities. And obviously, whether it was Dr. Gull or whether it was an accomplice who worked with Dr. Gull, we don't know. But we do know this. Many people have remarked that the killings themselves were obviously done by someone who was a surgeon. The cuts were done very, very carefully and with an extremely profound knowledge of human anatomy. Anyway, the first time, before Jack was called Saucy Jack or Jack the Ripper, the first nickname he gave himself was Leather Apron. Now, every Mason, when they are made a Master Mason, is given a white lambskin or leather apron. That is the badge of a Mason. Now, this illustrates how Masonry can be used, and is often used, to conceal crimes, even for a century. Now, the points of our entrance. The last one is probably the hardest to understand just from the way the term is, but points of your entrance is the way that a Mason stands, the way he approaches the altar in the east. And if you look, what you see up on the screen right now is the way an entered apprentice would approach the east. He has the heel of his right foot into the hollow of his left at right angles to one another. And that is the sign of an entered apprentice. Now, understand something. If I were to stand in a courtroom before a judge who was a Mason and put my feet in this way, he would know that I was at least an entered apprentice Mason. And he would be required by his oath to give me preferential treatment over my adversary in the courtroom. Now, this is the way a Master Mason does the same thing. Now here you'll notice the feet are at right angles to each other, the heels touching together. And this is the way a Master Mason would stand and approach the altar. And again, the same thing applies. If this person were to go into a court, or even like a job interview perhaps, and want to let people know that he was a Mason, he might stand this way and not have to say a word. It's interesting, though, that Proverbs chapter 6 and 12 says this: "A naughty person, a wicked man, walketh with a froward mouth. He winketh with his eyes, he speaketh with his feet, he teacheth with his fingers."
Stephen Knight's book, The Brotherhood, reveals many interesting details. One of his most startling revelations is the information that from 50 to 70% of all English judges are Freemasons. Lawyers find that they must join the Freemasons if they expect to get any clients. The Law Society is one of the most Masonic institutions in the world, notes King. 90% of its members are Masons. This creates great inequities, because the Law Society is the final judge as to who will receive the legal aid and who will be denied it. A non-Mason has no chance of receiving legal aid in a suit against a Mason. This is typical of the will of Canaan, the secret conspiracy against all who are not members of the tribe. The Masonic conspiracy, which casts a pall over legal procedures in England, is but one manifestation of its sinister influence. During the Elizabethan age, the fascination with the occult appeared in many underground organizations. It now finally brought to trial for treason in sensational proceedings, which were conducted in Richmond, Virginia. Here again, the Masons brought in their former Grand Master, Edmund Randolph, to defend Burr. Not surprisingly, the sitting judge was Chief Justice John Marshall, who was at that time Grand Master of the Lodge of Virginia. Burr was acquitted. Indeed, to have convicted him, one would have needed the strength to defy the entire Masonic Canaanite conspiracy in the United States. No such person appeared. The amazing acquittal of Burr by his Masonic fellow conspirators has been repeated thousands of times in the Virginia courts. Stephen King reports in The Brotherhood that in England from 50 to 70% of all judges are Masons, and that 90% of the members of the Law Society, corresponding to our Bar Association, are Masons. The legal system in the United States, from all appearances, has an even higher preponderance of Masons. Thus, we have no federal, state, or local courts. We only have Masonic courts. The result is that judicial decisions on rules of evidence, motions for or against discovery, and other legal procedures are decided solely on the basis of whether they will aid or injure a Mason involved in the suit. The Masonic Handbook commands, page 183 to 184, whenever you see any of our signs made by a brother Mason, and especially the grand hailing sign of distress, you must always be sure to obey them, even at risk of your own life. If you are on a jury, and the defendant is a Mason, and makes the grand hailing sign, you must obey it. You must disagree with your brother jurors, if necessary, but you must be sure not to bring the Mason in as guilty, for that would bring disgrace upon our order. It was for these reasons that Congressman Thaddeus Stevens sponsored a resolution demanding that Freemasonry be suppressed, denouncing it as a secret, oath-bound, murderous institution that endangers the continuance of Republican government, and further demanded that being a Mason would be cause for a peremptory challenge in court, and made it unlawful for a Mason to sit as judge in a trial involving another Mason. For years, thousands of Americans have been puzzled by the odd decisions rendered in our courts. They do not know what has taken place. The victims of these injustices have no way of knowing that they have been subjected to the errant assumptions of an Oriental despotism masquerading under the color of law, that no justice can be administered if the judge has taken an oath under penalty of death to always rule in favor of a brother Mason. But asks the doubter, what if both parties in the lawsuit are Masons, and the judge is a Mason? What then? In that case, my friend, the case will be judged on its merits. However, if a non-Mason is a party to the suit, he is bound to lose. The handbook continues. You must conceal all crimes of your brother Masons, except murder and treason, and these only at your own option. And should you be summoned as a witness against a brother Mason, be always sure to shield him. Prevaricate. Don't tell the truth in this case. Keep his secrets. Forget the important parts. It may be perjury to do this, it is true, but you are keeping your obligations. This writer knows of cases where a Mason was called into a case to commit perjury against his own brother in order to defend a fellow Mason. This writer has been involved in many lawsuits in which subordination of perjury by Masonic lawyers was the order of the day. altered records, legal documents, which the clerks of the court denied ever receiving, even though they had been personally handed to them, judges who do not bother even to read the motions filed by a non-Mason, and important documents supporting his charges which are stolen from his home, including copies of checks, receipts, and other vital papers. The Will of Canaan instructs these criminals is justice as it is handed out in the legal system, which is dominated by Masons, and Virginia is one of the prime offenders. This writer has frequently sent in complaints against Masonic lawyers and judges to the United States attorneys. In every case, the Department of Justice replied to documented evidence of blackmail and extortion, "You should hire a private attorney." In other words, find yourself a Masonic lawyer and take it from there. The Masonic Handbook says, if you cheat, wrong, or defraud any other society or individual, it is entirely your business. If you cheat governments even, Masonry cannot and will not touch you. But be very careful not to cheat, wrong, or defraud a brother Mason or lodge. Whoever else you may defraud, live up to your Masonic obligations. This again is merely a restatement of the Will of Canaan. This writer has seen his discovery demands ignored by the opponent without penalty, but in every instance, when the opponent and his Masonic lawyers make the most outrageous demands upon this writer, the judge never fails to place him under court order to provide whatever the opponent requests. In a recent suit in which this writer sued to recover substantial embezzlement of the proceeds of his History of the Federal Reserve Despotism, has become especially predominant in all of our legal proceedings. The court, where the despot rules, the symbolic bow or standing when the despot comes into the room, and the refusal of the despot to brook any questioning of his decision by a citizen, who can approach the judge only through an anointed priesthood, the legal profession. Some Americans optimistically decide to come into court representing themselves, which the people of Shem provided for specifically in their Constitution of the United States. But judges usually give such attorneys pro se short shrift. In states such as Virginia, where Masonic power rules the courts, judges have been known to boast that no attorney pro se will ever get a favorable decision in their court. A non-Mason who enters an American court today is placing himself at the mercy of an Oriental despot, hence the tyrannical actions of judges in sentencing to indeterminate prison sentences. Anyone who happens to displease them, or whose property is coveted by a Mason,